A drifter pulled a girl from the flames, then lost the only thing he had left. She knew his name, his past, and the secret that could ruin them both. So why did saving her feel like setting the whole world on fire? Willow Monroe was born under a sky full of hope and promise, the only daughter on a generous ranch where her father's booming laughter once carried across open fields. But that joy shattered in an instant, when a wild stallion threw him to the ground, ending his life beneath hooves that thundered like a final verdict. Her brothers drank cold water and gold fever in distant mining camps, never to return, chasing glimmers of wealth until their bodies lay broken by accident and disease, leaving Willow to bear the weight of their failures and dreams. Her mother, once vibrant and gentle, succumbed to a fever that swept through the household, her voice fading like a dying fire, until only the faintest echo of lullabies remained. When the bank foreclosed on the ranch she had grown to love, selling off fences, barns, and memories, Willow was left with her father's old six-shooter, a tarnished silver locket split down the middle, and a scar on her thigh that pulsed every time rain fell, reminding her that even wounds can reopen when least expected. She carried Scar quietly at 19, with calloused hands and a heart fortified by grief. She stepped onto a narrow trail heading west, where the land stretched in unforgiving plains, and jagged mountains loomed like silent judges. She slept under prickly juniper, her blanket tattered by thorn and wind, and woke to skies both cruel and magnificent, painting dawn in streaks of pink and orange that reflected the fierce hope burning within her chest. Storms chased her across canyons, lightning flared like angry specters, and the cold bit through her thin coat, yet with each challenge, her resolve grew stronger, sharper, as if survival itself had become her only must. When Willow arrived in Ashcliff, dust danced in the air like restless spirits, and the horizon glowed with the promise of both danger and redemption. The town was a skeleton of weathered wood buildings, a saloon door still swinging on rusty hinges, and windows dark with stories untold. Rough men leaned against walls, their eyes calculating, their voices low as they measured her worth in seconds. She felt their gaze as a weight on her shoulders, yet lifted her chin, letting the brim of her hat cast a shadow over eyes too weary to trust polite smiles. In the general store, old Marta offered her a corner of warmth among chipped shelves and dusty jars, teaching Willow how to coax life from a few tomato seedlings behind the building, a simple task that wove fragile threads of hope through Willow's shadowed heart. In the schoolhouse, Jane, the teacher whose calm voice had once quieted crying children, invited Willow to read stories by lamplight, reminding her how solace could be found in words. At the Broken Spur Saloon, Tom the bartender slid her a cup of bitter coffee and confided that the town had secrets darker than the shadows under his bar, and every whispered rumor was a clue to the puzzle of Ashcliff's soul. Each night, as wind honed its howl through the cracks in her rented room, Willow pressed her back against the door, and remembered her father's steady hand on her shoulder, her mother's soft songs, and her brother's laughter echoing across the field. She wrestled with doubt and desire, torn between the comfort of connection and the fear of pain's return, convinced that walls built around the heart were both a prison and a shield. Rumors flickered like desert embers, talk of a hidden gold vein in the hills that could revive the town, whispers of an outlaw hiding among them under a false name, and tales of a mysterious stranger with a heart scarred by betrayal. Willow listened with a detective's curiosity, piecing together half-truths and shadows, each fragment fueling a restless fire that told her her purpose lay beyond mere survival. Then came a choice that would define her destiny: to stand alone as a lone wolf, riding into the harsh sunset with nothing but memories and a pistol, or to lower her guard, forge alliances with the broken souls of Ashcliff, and risk everything for a chance at redemption and belonging. The weight of that decision settled in her chest like a promise she was not yet certain she could keep. When first light stretched across the dusty street, Willow Monroe stood in the doorway of her modest room, the pistol cold against her thigh, and the split locket warm against her heart, as its two halves brushed together like reunited souls, and as she breathed in the scent of sun-warmed earth and possibility, she felt the stirrings of a courage she once believed was lost, ready to discover if this town of faded hopes could become a place she would dare to call home. Late one night, a fight flared at the saloon when a rough-handed miner accused a drifter of stealing his horse. Chairs crashed, whiskey splashed, and the room filled with threats. Willow rose from her seat instinctively, heart hammering as she moved through the chaos, hand brushing the grip of her pistol. Before she drew, Tom the bartender and Jane the teacher stepped between the men, but the drifter's sneer and the miner's glare refused to relax. In the sudden hush, Willow's voice cut through like a blade demanding surrender and calm. The drifter paused, eyes flicking to the gun she held with unshakable resolve. Minutes later he stepped back and lowered his hand as the miner exhaled a broken laugh, ending the brawl without a single shot fired. From that moment whispers followed Willow like a trail of dust. Some said she was a savior, others a storm waiting to break, but all agreed she was more than just a lonely traveler. In the days that followed, the town's attitude toward her shifted. Children waved shyly in the street, merchants nodded with quiet gratitude, and weary travelers paused at the stable to admire her horse. Willow spent mornings repairing fences with the blacksmith, learning to wield a hammer with the same confidence she used with her pistol, and afternoons reading letters to old Marta that came from faraway lands, tales of oceans Willow had never seen but longed to imagine. She began to share small pieces of her past, not the darkest cruelties but memories of dancing in summer light with her family, of her mother's gentle hand brushing hair from her forehead. Each revelation built bridges from her heart to others, brick by careful brick, and she found that trust grew in the soil of vulnerability. One evening as fireflies flickered along the porch, a lone traveler arrived with a guitar and a newspaper that spoke of dangers in distant towns. He greeted Willow with a polite nod and asked about the room above the store. By lamplight that night they traded stories, his of lost homesteads and dusty highways, hers of hopes buried and freshly unearthed. The broken locket lay between them, its two halves balanced on the table like twin promises. In his eyes she saw the same hunger for redemption she carried in her soul, and she realized that together they might find what each had lost. While working in a dusty hotel, Willa saw a name that stopped her heart. Eli Canantrell. He had once worked for her father. Now he was wanted for murder. Curiosity pulled her into the saloon, where she saw him again, older, worn, quiet. She didn't speak to him that night, but she remembered everything. Days later, they locked eyes outside. "You worked the Monroe Ranch," she said. He remembered. After that, he left her small gifts, jerky, gloves, no words, just silent kindness. Something between them began to grow. Each gift he left felt like a whisper from the past, stirring echoes of the days before everything fell apart. Willa couldn't shake the memories, the smell of saddle leather, the sound of Eli's laughter when he was just a ranch hand, not a fugitive. She started leaving things for him too, notes tucked under stones, a scarf when the winds turned colder. Neither said much, but their silence grew louder, like thunder waiting on the edge of a storm. Willa asked around cautiously, threading questions into conversations like loose threads in a tapestry. Stories about Eli varied wildly. Some called him a thief, others said he took the fall for another man's rage. The sheriff passed through town once a week, eyes always scanning, boots tapping like a warning drum. Willa kept her head down, but her heart was no longer still. It beat wildly whenever she thought of Eli. One night she found a flower on her windowsill, wild and trembling, like the feelings she dared not name. The town whispered about them, but never to their faces. Everyone knew something had changed. Eli kept his distance, but there was a sorrow in his eyes, something haunted and beautiful. Willa wanted to ask him everything, what had happened, why he ran, who he really was now, but she knew the past had sharp edges, and questions could be dangerous blades. Still her curiosity burned. She followed the trail of his silence like breadcrumbs in the dark. She saw him once at the riverbank, staring at the water like it could wash away his sins. She didn't speak, just stood beside him, until the sun dipped low and shadows stretched long. He handed her a small wooden carving of a horse, smooth and warm from his hand. That night she cried for reasons she couldn't explain. Something inside her had shifted. The next morning, Eli was gone. No gifts, no signs, just absence. Willa felt it like a hollowness, as if the wind itself had changed. She searched the town, but no one had seen him, not even old Joe at the stables. Then a letter arrived. No name, just her name on the envelope, trembling ink on rough paper. He wrote of guilt, of wrong choices, of a debt he could never repay. He wrote of her kindness, how it reminded him he wasn't beyond save. He asked her to forget him, to live free of his shadow. But Willa couldn't forget. She read the letter until the words faded into her memory. She walked the hills sometimes, hoping to find a trace, a footprint, a sign he still breathed. She dreamed of him, sometimes young and laughing, other times bloodied and running. In her heart she believed he hadn't killed anyone, not truly, but belief couldn't change the past. Still she held on to hope like a candle in a cave. Seasons turned, snow fell, melted, and fell again. Willa grew older, but never stopped looking toward the horizon. Then one spring, a stranger came to the hotel, limping, face shadowed by his hat. He asked for water, and his voice struck a chord deep in her bones. She looked up, and there he was, older still, but unmistakably Eli. For a moment, neither moved. The world held its breath. Then she poured him water, her hands steady despite the storm inside. They didn't speak of the years lost, just sat beneath the sun, and remembered in silence. He spoke at last, a quiet confession about the man he once was, and the man he tried to be. He never said whether he killed the man, only that he ran to protect someone who couldn't protect herself. Willa didn't need the details. She saw the truth in his eyes. Somehow she forgave him, though he never asked for it. He left again the next day, leaving a carved bird this time, but now she knew he was out there, still carrying the weight, still trying to be better. And she waited, not hopelessly, but because sometimes the heart remembers what the world forgets. And in a town full of dust and whispers, Willa kept his memory like a flame behind glass. One night, Ashcliff burned. A wrongly jailed boy's uncle set the town on fire. Willa ran, but turned back when she heard a baby crying. She rushed into the flames and nearly died. But Eli pulled her out. "You're a damn fool," he whispered. "I thought you were one of the bad ones." She replied. "Guess you ain't the only one people get wrong," he said. After that night, something between them changed for good. The morning after, Ashcliff was smoke and ash, its buildings skeletal, streets littered with glass and scorched wood. People whispered of heroes and devils, but most were too busy mourning what they'd lost to speak loud. Willa stood by the charred inn, her hands blistered, her lungs raw, but her eyes searched only for Eli. She found him sitting alone behind the old jailhouse, cleaning soot from a silver locket he'd found in the rubble. He handed it to her without a word, and she understood it belonged to the child they'd saved. The baby had survived, somehow, and now slept swaddled in blankets at the doctor's cabin. Willa visited often, unsure why her heart clenched each time she saw those tiny fists twitch in sleep. The mother never came. No one claimed the child. The sheriff thought she died in the blaze. Days passed. Then weeks. Willa began carrying the baby herself, feeding her, humming lullabies Eli said he remembered from childhood. One night, while Willa rocked the baby near the still cracked saloon window, Eli leaned against the frame and said, "Funny how saving one life makes all the rest feel heavier." Willa looked up. "You've been carrying heavy things a long time." He didn't answer, but his eyes softened. That was enough. The town struggled to rebuild. Ashcliff's people had long memories and longer grudges. Some still thought Eli had something to do with the fire, and others claimed Willa had gone soft, but neither of them paid it much mind. They had work to do, and a baby who giggled at shadows and smiled at Eli like she'd known him forever. At night, Willa lay awake, wondering what made her turn back into that fire, whether it was instinct or something else, something deeper. She caught herself watching Eli when he didn't notice, noticing the way pain had etched itself into the lines of his face. He still said little, but his silences felt warmer now, as if they held space for her inside them. One evening they sat outside the hotel steps, the baby sleeping in Willa's lap, stars pushing through the smoke-smudged sky. Eli told her about his sister, the boy's mother, and how the fire had felt like history repeating, one flame chasing another. I couldn't save her, he said, voice low, but you, what you did, I never seen anyone run toward the fire like that. Willa looked down at the baby. She made a sound. I couldn't leave her. That's what makes you different, he said. You go back. She didn't know what to say to that, so she leaned her shoulder against his and watched the stars appear. Later she asked if he believed in second chance. He nodded slowly, then said, but they ain't free. Willa understood. She was paying too, in sleepless nights, in hands that shook when she smelled smoke, in memories that came uninvited, and yet there was something like peace growing in her, like wildflowers blooming through broken stone. People began to notice. They saw how Eli helped rebuild the blacksmith shop, how he never asked for thanks. They watched Willa carry the baby through town, her back straighter, her voice steadier. They started saying less behind closed doors, and more with nods in pass. Still, neither Willa nor Eli spoke of the fire again, not directly, not about that night, but their lives folded into one another like pages of a book too worn to close. She taught him how to read again, and he taught her how to track elk in the snow. They didn't talk of love, but it lived in the quiet places, in shared coffee, in patched windows, in hands brushing by accident, and not pulling away. Sometimes the baby cried at night, and Eli would walk the floor until her sobs melted into sleep. Willa watched him, wondering if he saw his sister in that child's eyes. She never asked, just held the silence with him. Then, one spring morning, a rider came into town, with a letter for Willa, official seal, unfamiliar name. She opened it on the porch, Eli beside her, the baby gurgling on a blanket. It was about the boy who'd been jailed, the fire starter's nephew. He'd been cleared, the truth had come out. The letter praised an anonymous tip, a packet of evidence delivered in secret weeks before. Willa turned to Eli. He didn't say a word, but she saw the truth in the way he stared at the horizon. She touched his arm. You did that, he shrugged, figured someone should. The letter offered a reward. Willa laughed and tossed it aside. What are we gonna do with money? Eli didn't answer, just looked at the baby, now reaching up to the sky like she could grab the clouds. In time, Ashcliff forgot the fire, but Willa never did. It lived behind her ribs like a match waiting to strike, a reminder of the day everything turned, and she chose not to run. Sometimes, strangers came through town, asking questions about that night. She never gave them much, just said, some folks were lost, some found, and when they asked about Eli, she'd smile and say, you'll have to judge for yourself, because truth wasn't simple in Ashcliff. It was layered, like coal, under earth, dangerous, slow burning, worth digging for. Willa kept the locket on her bedside. The baby, now walking, laughing, called Eli Pa. Before she even said mama, Eli never corrected her, just picked her up, and held her close. And Willa, watching them, understood something final. That fire hadn't destroyed everything. It had burned away the lies, the past, the doubt. What was left was raw, real, and unexpectedly whole. And so she stayed, even when others moved on, because sometimes, ashes make the richest soil, and in that soil, Willa had found something she never expected: family, love, and a future born of fire.
With the hotel gone, they joined a cattle drive north. Willa proved herself with a rope, earning her place. One night, a rustler came, and Eli killed to protect them. Willa remembered the poster that called him a murderer, but this wasn't murder. When a stampede hit, she fought through it, bloodied and bruised. Eli told her, "You ain't got nothing to prove. I'm not proving it to you," she said. They slept rough, lived hard. Willa learned to read the sky. She also learned Eli had pain he never spoke about, and secrets he carried like scars. The trail was long, cutting through heat-scorched plains and cold rivers that bit at their bones. Each day began with dust and ended with stars, and in between, they rode in silence or laughter, depending on the shape of the wind. Willa grew leaner, tougher,
her hands calloused from rope and rein, her back strong enough to carry more than saddlebags. She wasn't the only woman on the drive, but she was the only one who'd leapt into a stampede to turn the herd. That night, the men passed around a bottle and watched her with new respect, but she didn't want their praise. She wanted Eli's trust, and slowly she felt it, like thawing ice, reluctant but sure. Sometimes he'd speak of the war, how it had taken his brother and left him with nightmares. Other times he fell quiet at the edge of camp, eyes tracking stars like he was trying to read some old message in them. Once she asked him what he'd done to get wanted. He said, "Told the truth, when I wasn't supposed to." That stayed with her. Rain came in sheets one week, drenching their gear and softening the trail into sucking mud. Willa kept pace, even when her boots gave her blisters and her coat stuck to her skin. One night, Eli handed her a dry shirt without a word. She took it, and that silence meant more than 1,000 speeches. Coyotes cried in the distance, and sometimes cattle spooked, without reason. Eli always sensed it first, nudging his horse forward, eyes narrowing. She wondered if he could smell danger the way she could smell rain. Then one evening, a rider came out of the dark, coat flapping, face hidden. He called Eli by a different name. Willa didn't ask what it meant, just watched as Eli lied smoothly, calmly. Later he admitted, "There's folks who knew me before. Not all of them want me alive." Willa nodded. "I've got ghosts too." They never talked about hers, but he started keeping watch closer when she slept. She noticed, a child was born on the trail. One of the Hands' wives had traveled with them, stubborn as Willa. Willa helped deliver it, hands trembling but steady. Eli waited outside pacing. When the baby cried, he looked toward the sky, like something had just shifted inside him. Days turned into weeks, and the trail felt endless. They crossed places so quiet, it hurt the ears, and others, so loud with nature's voice, it filled the chest. Willa learned the different kinds of silence Eli had, the ones that meant thinking, mourning, remembering, and one night, he opened up, not much, but enough. He'd been framed for killing a man who'd hurt someone close. The law didn't care about the truth. "You think if you run long enough, you stop being who you were," he said. She didn't agree or disagree, just leaned into his side, and he didn't pull away. Some nights, they shared a blanket, not for love or want, but warmth, and in that closeness, something wordless passed between them. When they reached the northern pass, snow was beginning to crust the grass. They'd lost 2 cows, 1 man, and part of their innocence, but they'd made it. In town they sold the herd, and got paid. Eli gave most of his cut to the widow of the man who died. Willa watched him walk away from the money, like it meant nothing. She asked him once if he ever thought of settling. He said, "Not till I stop looking over my shoulder." Still, they stayed in that town a while, took odd jobs, waited. Willa learned to fix saddles and shoot better. Eli taught her how to play cards, but she beat him more often than not. A marshal rode in one day, posters in hand. Willa held her breath as he unfolded them. Eli's face wasn't on them. That night, she asked why he looked so tired. He said, "Because being free still don't feel free." She took his hand, rough and scarred, and said, "Maybe it's just not something you get alone." They stayed that way until morning. Eventually the trail called again, not the cattle one, but a different kind. One where the road wasn't marked, where danger hid in whispers and campfire stories. They chased rumors of the man who'd set Eli up, now working under a different name, sheriff in a town called Alder Hill. Eli didn't ask her to come, but she came anyway. Alder Hill was too clean, too quiet, the kind of place where secrets were buried deep. Willa found work at the general store. Eli kept low. They watched, listened, waited. Then one day they saw him, older, fatter, but that same mean glint in his eyes. Willa said, "You sure?" Eli said, "I'd know his face in hell." They could have run again, but Willa said, "We've been running long enough." They planned carefully, gathered stories, made allies quietly. Willa charmed an old drunk into talking. Turned out the sheriff had left behind a trail of silence, paid with blood. They didn't go to the law, they went to the people. When the truth came out, it came like thunder. Eli stood in the center of town and told his story,
voice steady. Willa stood beside him, hand resting near her hip. The townsfolk didn't cheer, but they didn't hang him either. The sheriff ran, didn't even pack a bag. A new man was sworn in, the wanted posters were burned. Eli watched the flames, and said, "Still don't feel real." Willa said, "Maybe that's because it ain't over." Not yet. They rode out a week later, not because they had to, but because that's who they were now. Trail folk, fireborn, true only to each other. The wind followed them, and behind it, the faint sound of a baby crying, except it wasn't a baby, it was memory, and memory they'd learned, always rode close.
One night, a woman named Ruth arrived, leading armed riders. She was there for Eli. He had killed her brother. Willa demanded to know why. Eli confessed. Ruth's brother helped burn her family's barn. The fire that killed Willa's father. Eli had hunted him down. Willa shook, her past came roaring back. But when Ruth raised her gun, Willa stood between them. "He saved me," she said. "He's mine to reckon with." That night, Willa opened the letter Eli always carried. It read, "If you come back, bring mercy." The fire had always been a blur in Willa's mind. Smoke and screaming, and the crack of beams splitting under heat. Now, standing across from Ruth, the truth burned hotter than the flames ever had. Willa's voice trembled, but she didn't lower her gaze. Ruth's eyes were full of grief, but not surprise. "He told you?" she asked. Willa nodded. Ruth's hand didn't fall, but her anger seemed to shift, like she wasn't sure who the enemy was anymore. Willa said, "You came for justice. I get that, but I lived that night too. I lost him too." The riders behind Ruth murmured, uncertain. Eli stood still, hands at his sides. Unarmed, he said, "I'm not sorry I stopped him. I'm sorry I didn't do it sooner." The wind blew dry across the camp, rattling the coals of their fire, sending ash into the sky, like ghosts rising. Willa looked down at the letter again, the paper soft at the creases, edges darkened by time. It was signed by a preacher, someone from Eli's past. She didn't know if the mercy was for Eli, or for the man he killed, or for the boy he used to be. That night, they didn't sleep. Ruth and her men set camp nearby. Tension hung between them like a drawn bow. Willa couldn't stop thinking about her father, about the smell of smoke and the crackling roar. She remembered Eli's arms around her that night in Ashcliff, the way he dragged her out of the flame. He'd saved her twice now, once with his body, once with his truth. The next morning, Ruth approached the fire. She sat across from Willa, eyes swollen from lack of sleep. "He was my brother," she said, "but he wasn't good." Willa said nothing. Some pain needed room to speak itself out. Ruth glanced at Eli. He took the law in his hands. "Now I got to decide what to do with that." Eli didn't flinch. "I'll ride with you if you want, but Willa stays." Willa slammed her cup down. "No, if you go, I go." The fire crackled. Ruth looked between them, jaw tight. Then she pulled the gun from her belt and tossed it to the dirt. "I ain't got the heart for killing today," she muttered. She stood and walked back to her men. Willa watched her go, heart pounding, legs weak. Eli sat beside her. "You didn't have to stand in the way," she replied. "Yes, I did. I just didn't know I would." He handed her the letter again. She read it aloud this time, slow and even. It spoke of guilt and redemption, of a boy who never meant to be hard, but had to survive things he couldn't name. It was a letter of confession and prayer. Willa folded it carefully, handing it back. "You ever write her back?" she asked. Eli shook his head. "Didn't think I had the right." "You still might," Willa said. The following days felt like the edges of a storm. The air was tight with unspoken thought. Ruth's riders moved on, but she lingered. She helped Willa fetch water one morning, her silence less heavy now. "He really saved you?" Ruth asked. Willa nodded. "He saved who I became." That answer seemed to sit right with Ruth. She left that afternoon with no more threats, just a nod. Eli stood watching, until the dust from their horses settled. Willa touched his hand. "You should write her." He did, that night by firelight, hands trembling slightly. Willa didn't read what he wrote, but she saw his face change as he sealed the envelope. The letter joined the first, tucked inside the small leather pouch he carried close to his chest. Later, under the stars, Willa asked, Do you think we'll ever stop looking back? Eli answered. Only when looking forward hurts less. They lay close that night, the weight between them shifting from sorrow to something more like understanding. She dreamed of her father, smiling beside the barn, waving. When she woke, her chest ached, but her hands felt lighter. The next town they rode into had no idea who they were, and for a little while that was enough. They settled in Fremont, taking a small room. Willa worked stables. Eli hauled freight and gambled. Some nights they talked until morning. Other nights they said nothing. They didn't know what they were, something between trust and waiting. Then came a telegram from Ruth. She wanted a final meeting. Snow fell as they rode to Greenwich. Eli offered Ruth his gun. She flipped a coin to decide his fate. It landed on its edge. Willa picked it up and said, "No clear choice." Ruth nodded and walked away. The days passed slowly, each one marked not by clocks, but by the steady, invisible erosion of expectations. Fremont wasn't a place for futures. It was a place for breathing, recovering, forgetting. The walls of their room were thin, and so were their words, carefully measured like the last drops from a dry canteen. Willa's hands bore the scent of leather and hay, always moving, always silent. Eli came home dusty, tired, his eyes a story he never told. He rarely won, but he kept gambling, not for money, but for the feeling of luck brushing close. They moved around each other with a rhythm, not quite choreographed, but learned, like two horses trained by the same hand. On Fridays, Willa would hum while brushing the horses, a melody Eli tried to remember, but never could. On Sundays, he'd bring back half-won bread and leave it on the table like an offering. The world outside was loud with choices and chances, but inside their little room, it was quiet with maybe. Ruth's telegram came in winter, delivered by a boy who didn't wait for a tip. It was short, "Meet me, one last time, Greenwich." Eli didn't ask questions. He just saddled the horse. Willa came without needing to be invited. The snow fell thick, hiding tracks, softening sounds. Greenwich stood still, waiting like a held breath. Ruth waited by the fence, older somehow, and tired in a way makeup couldn't hide. Eli didn't say hello. He offered her the gun, the same one they all remembered. She took it slowly, not looking at him. "We were never settled," she said. "We were never done." Then she flipped the coin, and it rose, spinning like it was trying to rewrite time. When it landed on its edge, they stared. It didn't fall, didn't choose. Willa reached down and picked it up. "No clear choice," she said, not to Ruth, not to Eli, but to whatever gods were listening. Ruth nodded like someone who finally understood a riddle too late. She left without looking back, her coat flapping like wings too worn to fly. Fremont never got louder. Days melted together. Willa still worked the stables. Eli gambled less, sat more. Sometimes they'd lie awake, the ceiling turning into sky, wondering what might have happened if the coin had fallen one way or the other. Sometimes Willa would say, "She could have shot you." Eli would shrug, say, "She didn't." Other times neither spoke, letting silence fill the room with something not quite grief, not quite relief. They grew older in increments, not noticing until a mirror or ache reminded them. They didn't call it love, they didn't name it, but it lived there, in their habits, in the way Willa would always make 2 cups of coffee, even if Eli was late, in the way Eli always left the door unlatched if Willa was still out. Years passed. Fremont began to disappear from maps, from stories, but their room stayed the same. Dust settled like snow. They watched neighbors leave, watched buildings turn to bones. One spring, Willa found the coin again, tucked in a drawer with old notes and hairpins. It was duller now, but still unmarked. She placed it on the mantel, on its edge, where it stayed. Visitors came, sometimes, travelers lost or curious. They'd ask about the coin. Eli would say, "It chose not to choose." Willa would smile, soft and far away. The coin became a kind of myth. Some said it was balanced by fate, others said it was glue, but only they knew the truth. The coin had landed honestly, defiantly, choosing the balance between endings. They aged without drama. Willa's hands stiffened, Eli's memory softened. Still each morning came with ritual, coffee, silence, the brushing of boots. They lived a life not of passion but of endurance, not of fire but of steady light. When Willa died one winter night, Eli found her with the faintest smile. He buried her behind the stables, where she had taught horses to trust again. He didn't cry, but he sat beside the grave every evening, talking to her like she'd just gone inside. The coin stayed on the mantle, untouched. When Eli followed her a year later, no one came for the room, no family, no friends, only time. A wind blew through Fremont, lifting dust, bending grass. The room remained quiet, filled with echoes, and the coin remained perfectly still, perfectly balanced. Willa left alone. But when a wounded man arrived at her door, carrying Eli's revolver, she knew Eli had gone to finish what he started. She rode into the frozen wilderness of Wyoming, following the trail. She found Deeks and Tolliver, the other men responsible for the fire. She didn't kill them, but she made sure they felt what they'd buried. Then she found Eli, feverish and near death in a cabin. She cared for him until he could speak again. When she said she was leaving, he asked, "You want me to follow?" She looked at him. "I want you to try." The snow was deep, the sky dim with the heavy gray of late winter, and each hoofbeat echoed through the quiet like a memory, trying to surface. Willa rode hard, not because she knew exactly where to go, but because not going would have meant giving up. She stopped at outposts, and asked cold questions. Some lied, others didn't know, but enough people remembered the fire, remembered the men who lit it, the ones who didn't look back. Deeks was drunk in a mining town, laughing too loud in a place too dark. Willa watched him for a full hour before stepping in. She didn't speak, she just sat across from him, until the color drained from his face. She said, "You remember me?" He nodded. She didn't raise a hand, but somehow he flinched. "All the same, I ain't who I was," he said. "Neither am I," she answered, and walked out. Tolliver was harder to find, buried deep in a logging camp, under a false name, older, slower, but not changed. Willa didn't threaten him. She didn't need to. She made him dig up the story, what they did, why they did it, and the lies they told to live with it. When he finished talking, he cried. She left him there, shovel in hand, staring at the snow like it might answer. Eli's trail was fainter, broken by storm and time. She followed it past rivers half frozen, past ridgelines howling with wind. Her horse limped near the end. She walked the last miles. When she found the cabin, she almost didn't recognize him, his face pale, body thinner than she remembered. He'd crawled there with a gut wound, and nothing but stubbornness. Willa didn't speak at first. She just worked, found water, boiled roots, wrapped the wound. At night she read from a journal she found near his bed. It wasn't filled with stories, just lines, names, places, and one phrase written over, owed not forgotten. He woke on the third day, confused, weak. "You came," he whispered. She nodded. "I said I might." He smiled, a little, as his fever broke. She gathered supply. "Where you going?" he asked, voice cracking like frost. "Back east, maybe south." He looked at her with the same fear she used to carry. "You want me to follow?" he asked, voice small. She paused, boots already at the door. "I want you to try." Then she stepped into the wind, not looking back. Eli did try, slowly, each day a little more. He stitched up his coat, marked his map, and left a letter under a stone. "I'm trying." The road ahead was long. He didn't know where she'd gone, not exactly, but he knew her pace, her habits, how she built fires low, how she rode slightly left of the trail. Willa moved through towns like a rumor. Some said she passed through a churchyard, and left flowers for someone no one remembered. Others said she joined a traveling medicine show, using a fake name, but keeping her knife close. Eli followed slowly, trading stories for direction. He stopped fights instead of starting them. He wrote in his journal again,
less about debt, more about hope. He was no longer chasing revenge. He was following something harder, forgiveness. At night, he practiced saying what he meant. You matter. I was wrong. I'm still here. When Willa heard he was coming, she didn't smile. She just set an extra plate on the table, just in case. The cabin she found months later was different, cleaner, warmer, with a garden out front. It wasn't home, but it was shelter. When he arrived, days behind, she opened the door before he knocked. I tried, he said, voice hoarse. She let him in. They didn't kiss, they didn't embrace, they just sat. And in the quiet, the world rearranged itself again. Years passed, the land healed, trees grew where fire had burned. Children in town asked about them, the woman who rode alone, the man who came late. They heard different stories, that she was a ghost, that he was chasing penance, but in truth, they were just two people, who had lost too much to forget, and still chose to begin again. The revolver stayed locked in a box beneath the floorboards, and the coin that once balanced fate stayed by the window, collecting dust. Neither of them spoke of Ruth, of Deeks, of Tulliver. Some pain is remembered better, in silence. What they built was slow, morning coffee, tending a garden, walking side by side. Love wasn't declared, it was witnessed. When one of them got sick, the other stayed. When one of them woke in the dark, the other reached across the bed. They never said it was over, they never called it peace, that it was enough. And in the end, that was all they'd ever really wanted.
Months had drifted into silent solstice on that remote cattle station, where the wind whispered over taut wire fences, instead of gunshots rattling in the dawn. Willa's days were filled with the slow rhythm of hooves grazing the dusty paddocks, her heart learning to beat in time with the ebbing loneliness sprawling across the plains. The sunsets painted the horizon in bruised purples and embers of gold as she rode along boundary lines, each dawn a promise of survival rather than surrender. Then came the thundering hooves of a lone rider, whose silhouette stung her vision like a ghost from another life. He reined in with a slow exhalation of pain, limping into her world as persistently as memory itself. His eyes carried the leftover ash of battles waged in the lungs of dusty corridors, and the scars that traced his weathered skin told stories she could only guess at. She held her breath against the gale of old fears and new hopes, her voice barely a tremor, as she whispered, "I didn't think you would." He offered no bravado, only a weary curl of his lips that spoke of redemption, clinging to the edges of despair. "I didn't either," he confessed in a low drawl that held both regret and relief. "I'm not yours," she said, with quiet steel, and silence bowed between them. He nodded, acknowledging the chasm that memory had carved into their lives, but then he murmured, "I know, but I'll ride with you," each word a pledge stronger than any binding oath. For a long moment, she regarded him with eyes that had known too many lies and too much loss, measuring whether the man before her was flesh or fragment. He was more than either. He was a testament to persistence, a man who had burned and bled, and yet refused to vanish like smoke in the sun. "You survived," she said, and her voice cracked with astonishment, and something softer, something like longing. His answer was silence, but his steady gaze spelled a promise deeper than any vow. Then came a distant rumble on the wind. They both stiffened, ears pricked to the ghost of a forest fire that once defined their world. Her pulse thrummed with memories of crackling heat, and her skin prickled at the thought of brimstone skies again. He shifted, his boots scraping the earth in time with her tremor. "Even if the fire comes again," he asked, voice threaded with challenge. She met that challenge with a slow, resolute smile, touched by both defiance and relief. "If it does, let it try me," she said, as though the land itself existed to test her spirit. Their horses shifted, marking the tension and the fragile thread of trust weaving between two souls. And in that moment, the fences around the station felt less like boundaries and more like witness to a rekindled alliance. They would ride this land together, facing both calm and chaos, bound by no promises but the ones written deep in their bones. With one last glance at the blood-orange sky, she nudged her mount forward and he followed. The plains stretched out before them like an open page awaiting their story. Hope, brittle as dawn's light, fluttered in her chest, and he rode beside her, a living echo of every scar and every victory that had brought him back to her. Number of characters.